right, everybody, we're going to get started. Good morning and welcome to you all. I'm Kristen Lord. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the United States Institute of Peace. I'm absolutely delighted to have joining us this morning our longtime friend and colleague, Leon Fuerth, who's a research professor at George Washington University. And I know you've all seen his formal bio, but suffice it to say that Leon is one of the most forward-leaning, creative thinkers I've encountered who's been part of our government, and we're really fortunate to have him here with us today, but also as someone who's constantly trying to get our government to think a little bit differently. We will also be joined by Ambassador Tom Pickering, who you know is a very esteemed person who is constantly turned to for his judgment. He's a bit tied up these days, having co-authored the Benghazi report, something associated.
So he's now being attacked for his judgment, unfortunately.
I know he is, but I think there's a reason why people consistently turn to him for his judgment. Yep. So I'll leave it at that. But he will be joining us in just a little bit. So in just a few minutes, he will walk through the door. So we're going to go ahead and get started without him. What we thought it would be useful to do first was just ask Leon to tell us a bit about the Anticipatory Governance Report, the work he's been doing for really more than a decade, I think, with the Forward Engagement Project at GW. And then once he lays out what's in the report and what he's recommended, then I'll ask him some questions. Ambassador Pickering will have some responses as well. And then we'll open it up to all of you, and we really hope to have a discussion with a significant portion of this program. And then we'll wrap on time at 11:15. Leon, may I turn it over to you?
Do you have a choice?
I do.
Yeah. Yes, you may. You want me to stand over there?
It is up to you.
Thank you.
You're mic'd if you wish to sit or
I've
stand.
been lecturing for a long time now, and I'm now more comfortable doing something like that. Don't worry, these are not speaking notes. There we go. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of a way to begin that ties it to the choice you all have made in terms of your interest in the subject of peace and peacemaking. I was born in 1939, and I vaguely remember World War II from the perspective of a kid. And then in the immediate post-war years, I remember being able to go to the movies on Saturday for a quarter. Now, most of the movies at that time were either Westerns, which I didn't like, or they were World War II type movies. Trouble is that when I came out of those movies, I was asking myself, well, why did people do those things to each other? Why was there war? Not a typical question for an 8 or 9-year-old, I guess. But it was one of the questions that drove the way I grew up and the answers that I was looking for then, and I guess the answers that one still looks for now. Now, just briefly, and this may come up between us in our discussion later, there are different ways to look at the subject of keeping the peace, restoring the peace, making peace. One of them, and I don't know which way you come at it, but one of those ways is to think that peace is a natural condition of mankind if only you could deal with externalities that push us into conflicts that would otherwise not occur. The other way of looking at it is that war and cruelty are hardwired into human nature. And so the condition of peace is not the normal default condition. The condition of war is the normal default condition, and that history requires us not to allow nature to take its course so that we could all be at peace with each other. Instead, it may require us to continuously fight what is hardwired into human nature. It's difficult to look at the world, and it's difficult to look at the history of the world without concluding that actually the emotional and cognitive tendencies that lead to conflict are not hardwired into us. And that means that at any moment, given a chance, they will assert themselves. It requires a different kind of image of what the condition of peace is. And in some ways, that leads me to the question of anticipatory governance and the question of the role of foresight in governance. In the last 2 years of the Clinton-Gore administration, I began to think about what might be done to improve the system that we were using for dealing with national security issues. And because of the unusual degree to which Vice President Gore had been integrated into those, I wasn't looking at these things as a collection of issues where we would have done otherwise and should do otherwise in the future. I looked at it as an area where what had been accomplished should not be repudiated but built upon. I was aware of only one thing that I thought needed to be improved, and that was the need for longer range awareness of what was coming at us, because of what I sensed to be an acceleration in the rate of encounter between our country and our society, and the major developments which, as they matured, could threaten the well-being of the people of the United States and ultimately could threaten their physical security. In short, I had the sense, based on my operational experience, that things were accelerating, and I recognized that the acceleration could simply be an optical effect based on my own psychology or on the well-known consequences of getting older. But I believed instead, after some discussion with the National Science Advisor of the time, that it would be better to think of this acceleration as an unintended consequence of Moore's Law, that the acceleration of computational capacity, bandwidth, and communications was objectively causing an acceleration of new developments that were capable of testing the capacity of the existing system to manage and to retain its integrity, or to change at a rate that permitted orderly transitions from one period of time to another. So my idea in those last 2 years was we needed longer time, deeper foresight. It wasn't in order to be able to formulate policy. And it wasn't my idea that we could predict the future. It was my idea that we could try to anticipate different futures, and we could develop a rigorous system inside the government, especially at the top, to think about policy lines in connection with possible alternative futures. It is an illusion to believe that you can steer the future. The problem is whether or not, as someone who inherits responsibility, given it, wins it at the election, whether it is possible to be prepared for change and always preparing for change, or whether you are always going to consider the arrangement that you've got and the take that you've got on what's coming to be permanently correct, and therefore whether you and those who inherit your views and the consequences of your actions, whether those people are always going to be caught flat-foot by the simple fact that life does not deliver what you plan. It delivers surprise. It delivers discontinuity. And so I invented a concept called forward engagement. It was a very simple idea, and the idea was to try to create a venue where organized foresight and policy could be brought together in an effort to give us more time in which to deliberate over what was coming towards us, more time to debate over what to do about it, and more time to correct for errors. Well, the election turned out as it did, and I wound up accepting an invitation to come across the street to GW and to do whatever I wanted for 2 years. Since hanging out in a warm climate was not an option, for those 2 years, I decided I wanted to teach, and what I wanted to do was to see whether young students, although I had one who was 97 years old, and he was as young inside his head as anybody else, but it was to see whether young people could be taught what I was thinking about doing, or whether it was just an idiosyncratic idea of mine that was non-transferable to others and therefore non-transferable to a system. I can tell you that after 10 years of teaching, it is definitely transferable to all but an unfortunate few of students, but for the most part, it is transferable. Usually after about the 10th week of instruction in a 15-week course, you can tell that they've got it and they're switched on. At any rate, somewhere along there, I began to try to answer other questions about the practicalities of applying foresight. And out of that came something that I called anticipatory governance. Anticipatory governance was an effort to look at an entire system that was built to use foresight. And that led me into some interesting places. First of all, I had one segment that had been working out for 2 years, and that was what is foresight? How does it differ from intelligence in the formal sense? How can it be promoted? How can it be integrated into policy? And then I began to ask, well, how do you use something like this inside of government? Which led to an examination of government as I knew it, and then, because I had the chance to study and talk to academics, government as others were analyzing it. What came out of that? We had the best possible government for the late 19th century and maybe up to the first 50 years of the 20th century. It was a government organized essentially on the model of the corporate system, particularly the large manufacturing corporate system as it existed. It was therefore vertical, highly bureaucratized, with systems that were narrowly described so that everybody stayed in their lane, and the pieces of the puzzle were to be delivered on time as described by specifications written higher up. Vertically organized, not prone to exchange information laterally, not good at integrating information across the top either. The interagency system, with which I was intimately involved, was a way of getting information out in the open, but it really was something like an appellate system in which the different parts of the government, each out to defend its own philosophical take on how to deal with the world, and sometimes each out to protect its own slice of the pie in terms of the budget, were out to essentially knock out everybody else's favorite ideas about what to do except their own. Now, that is not a true fusion. It's not a system that it can occur, but it's not a system that has an automatic bias built into it for cross-fertilization and for fusion of ideas. It's a system in which the pieces are essentially trying to protect home turf. Okay, and so you wanted to think about how you develop governance that can be adaptable for something like foresight if you happen to believe that all of the divisions of knowledge and functions that we were using were ill-suited for the coming time. And I believe that believe that in government. But then I got a chance to read about complexity theory once I reached the university. And complexity theory, in a few words, crystallized what I felt in a diffuse sort of way. Complexity is not a metaphor. It is a name for a real state of relationship that exists for the most part throughout the universe. And it certainly exists in governance. Complexity means that you have a system in which you cannot really identify what is the driver and what is driven with any great certainty. In fact, it is better to see all elements of the system as being interlocked in some fashion, and to understand that any event anywhere in the system causes changes to ripple out through the rest of the system. That means, when you apply it to policy, that the idea of a single silver bullet solution to an issue, the favorite way in which campaign platforms are written, that idea is false. That any effort to resolve a solution by reducing it to simple algebra where there is a dependent variable and an independent variable is going to be misleading. It means that in the course of applying resources and energy for solving a problem, what you really are doing is mutating it. It means that the management of an issue in public policy, any kind of public policy, not just military policy, involves an awareness that is almost like the conservation of problems. You can change a problem, but you can't make the capacity for problems in politics and policy to go away. You must be alert for the change, and if possible, you must be studying the ways in which change could occur, not because you can predict it, but because it sensitizes you to the reality that all human efforts generate unanticipated consequences. Okay, and the unanticipated consequences are the things that define the next generation of issues for policy people. Great. I found my solution to the organizational question in something called net-centric warfare, which had been developed in the 1990s. And net-centric warfare was a concept involving eliminating the middle layers of management, pushing the authority to take action out to the perimeter of an organization, and encouraging the participants in that network to take the responsibility for taking action. A really quite radical proposition when it comes to military matters, because when you think of the military, you think of rigid top-down control. Trouble is that in warfare, events come so fast and the unexpected consequences are so fierce that a system like that is a setup for disastrous failure, and you need something else. So I saw that there was a very highly developed theory of this, which to me appeared to be a transposition of ideas from complexity theory to ideas about managing the military. But I thought that this approach was transferable to governance in general, and it led me to the question, how do you assure that issues which defy vertical organization can be handled across the normal barriers? And this is a formidable problem because those barriers are established in law. Every federal agency has a mandate. It has congressional oversight, which is there to make sure that the agency operates within its mandate. The system resists having to come to grips with subject matter that absolutely crosses all of these definitional and legal barriers. And yet the critical issues of our time are precisely those that cross these barriers and demand forms of organization that deal with that. Now, the military have been working at this for maybe 30 years. Taken them 30 years, among other things, to train officers to try, as they reach the peak of their careers, to be able to think of conflict, and conflict prevention for that matter, without regard to the original colors of their uniforms. It was called the purple stripe, something like that. You may have come up through ground warfare, air warfare, naval warfare, even space warfare. But by the time you reach the upper layers, you should be able to think of the issue of conflict first, and the question of the means in a very secondary way. It suggests that before we can get people in the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, and the Treasury to think about economic issues across barriers, it might take a generation of training people too. Now, the third element here is the one which usually causes people's eyes to glaze over when I mention it, and that is the issue of feedback. Okay, well, I was an early audio freak. I used to assemble my electronic equipment out of kits. Later on, to earn money for graduate school, God help me, I wrote manuals for those kits. And I still hope that I haven't electrocuted various people across the country with the instructions for these. But a major feature in these kits was feedback. And then I started to read books about cybernetic theory. I had a very unusual adolescence. And then it occurred to me that feedback was a missing element in the way we do government. What is feedback? From cybernetic theory, feedback means the use of a portion of the output of a system to help regulate the behavior of the system. All right, and so in a system that's applying feedback, you are attempting as a designer of the system to define the kind of output you want, and then you work backward from that to figure out how you can take the output, which will contain distortions, and apply it ahead of the system to cancel them out. Now, in government as we practice it, feedback is usually relegated to the so-called case study. That's fine. It means let the war be over, let 5 years pass, let somebody out there in an institution decide they want to do a case study, let them spend 3 years doing it, and then this thing arrives, and it's scholarship, but it's useless for the purpose of modifying what is then underway between the government and the society. Feedback needs to be in something like real time, right? And there's no feedback system that I know of in government, and I thought maybe in the 20 years since I left it, it had changed. The answer is it hasn't. A feedback system would be one in which a president, for example, is well aware, because his system tells him what a new policy is supposed to accomplish and approximately by when, and there is in place a system beyond the influence of his cabinet people and his White House staff, which is going to be gauging what is going on and which is going to re-inject that information at a level where change can be made. And the objective of that kind of feedback system is at least to give a president a chance to recognize that a policy is not necessarily doing what it was sold to do, and an opportunity to change it in time to matter, as opposed to the normal process, which is to stay with that policy until it crashes and burns. And then you get, maybe if you get reelected, you get a chance to start it all over again. And so I came to the conclusion that there were three components to an anticipatory system. One of them was what I started with in forward engagement, that is, create venues where foresight and policy could be given a chance to be interactive. The second was to create a means to network operations in governance. And the third was to install a feedback system operating pretty comprehensively across the board. I got a pretty good grant from the MacArthur Foundation to pursue anticipatory governance, and around the same time an invitation from the National Defense University to come over and to continue to pursue it, and I did. And it resulted in a publication which I think you all can get out there if you're not carrying it already, and it's on the web. And that publication is an effort to show something else about anticipatory governance. It is that this is not a dream system. It is a system based on relatively common sense, straightforward adaptations, which can pass about three standards. One of them is they don't need an omnibus bill. They can be implemented by a president under existing law and with existing customary authorities. Because if you had to go to the Congress to ask for an omnibus bill to do something like this, I mean, I'd like a show of hands as to who thinks we will succeed, because there is the last surviving optimist in the Western Hemisphere. Next, these systems cannot involve the creation of bureaucracies. Preferably, they should be done essentially by giving people double and triple work, but by culling out the ones who want that opportunity, whose method of thinking is not vertical as intended, but horizontal. These are the ones who are usually doodling at interagency meetings because their minds are running that way, left and right. They are the ones you have to find. They are the ones with the orthogonal take on what needs to be done. They need to be protected so that their careers are not jeopardized by the lack of orthodoxy. These things are possible. They need to be consistent with existing processes and not presented as ways to disrupt them. In other words, they have to blend in rather than shove aside. And that's pretty much it. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Leon.
Perfect timing. I have already said just about everything you heard me say ad nauseum before. And I have sketched out the content of anticipatory governance as a series of ideas about giving government the capacity to anticipate, and more particularly the capacity to be fast off the mark once it becomes clear that motion is necessary, and to think backwards from a desired outcome to the necessary preparations so that we do less catch-up ball in the world. Now this, I think, is a good place for me to stop.
Well, thank you, Leon, and we'll be fast off the mark and turn to Ambassador Pickering. Ambassador Pickering, first of all, welcome, and I know you're very familiar with the report that Leon has. That's fine. That Leon has prepared, and the concepts of anticipatory governance he just shared with all of us. If you could imagine that we had listened to Leon when he first started this project and 10 years ago had actually implemented some of the suggestions he's recommended, how would our foreign policy look different today?
Thank you, Kristen, very much, and I hope it's okay for me to stand up here and talk about this, because while I haven't heard what Leon said this time, Leon is a demon on anticipatory government. Never varies a millimeter from his past statements, and I'm going to try to pick those up.
Is that why people run for me in parties?
No. Let me do this against the backdrop of three simple propositions, which I think are one of the fundamental pillars of what Leon and the team has put together. And they really relate to foresight, in effect to greater collaborative effort, perhaps best summarized as what we would call smart networking, and then the period after, when in effect two kinds of efforts are engaged. One, how are we doing? And the second, basically, what were the lessons that we need to kind of pick up our socks on? And so against that backdrop, I'd like to talk about three issues in current foreign policy that one way or another I believe would have benefited enormously from the application of anticipatory government. And much of this, I think, will become self-evident, but let me try to tick off some of the points that I think are most useful. And I want to start from the oldest issue and perhaps the biggest, and in my view, the most calamitous. This was the early effort in the Bush administration to do what I like to summarize as to substitute military force for the exercise of diplomacy. And that was Iraq. And in many ways, Iraq represents, I think, an enormous learning opportunity for us with respect to this conjunction of issues. Had there been adequate foresight and indeed the application of some of the basic principles of looking down the road ahead, we would have seen several things that I think are apparent afterward, that there was no germane, relevant, and indeed significant national interest reason for our engagement. There were allegations of weapons of mass destruction, and there was an opportunity through the United Nations Commission to pursue that to perhaps the end of the process. Certainly all subsequent research after the fact proved that they would have once again ratified the notion that Saddam Hussein, for his own reasons, had in fact dismantled and destroyed the major share of that program, even though in fact we were not able prior to the effort to prove it, but we didn't wait long enough. The second major question was what I would call the fantasy of the Hollywood complex, or the Shalaby issue. This was that once the combat operations were over, we would walk off with a new Iraqi democratic leadership hand in hand in the sunset to wonderful music, and that it would all become right, and that the single combat operation was sufficient, capable, and indeed effective in achieving that objective, forgetting what happens when you have to look for the next shoe to drop. And it was interesting because that would have worked better had there been genuine networking. And indeed, there was a State Department, the famous 100-page report, prepared precisely to look at the down-the-road consequences of military action in Iraq, and it was like the proverbial Baird carrier landing waved away. Indeed, it was, in fact, according to what I know, positively submerged. And so it represented the worst aspects of stovepiping, that we in that building over there have full control of this. We know exactly what we're doing. Don't question either our capacities or our motives, and if we need you, we'll call you, but don't stand by. And this was basically a studied effort to push away, I think possibly because diplomats carry, unfortunately, the wimp burden. Diplomats who had spent a lot of time in that part of the world knew the languages, the cultures, and a lot of the players from the issue. On the after-action piece, I think it is extremely important that for years, we then found ourselves in the position of this. Defense, quite rightly, said, this is not our field of expertise, you guys in state do it. State was interested, but the ability to energize the Congress, much less in our scarce personnel resources in this country, to dredge up a broad combination of people with a wide variety of Arabic language skills who also knew and understood something about Iraq, but also had the skills and capacities, the engineering background, the technical background, the development background was pretty hard. And we were also heavily engaged in a number of other places where these same types of scarce resources were needed. I have to compliment the military. As always, they rose to the occasion with the best that they could put together. And some of the military activities was exceptional and outstanding. And some of it obviously lacked a sense of engagement. But they had not been trained, they had not been prepared, and they had not been, in my view, mobilized and organized. And so the rollout of the lessons was clearly that we were not functioning up to snuff, that we had many changes to make. And I think in the main, this country owes a great debt to David Petraeus, who understood this early in his leadership of the 101st Airborne Division in northern Iraq, and then attempted, as he was brought back, to apply the lessons to Iraq as it went down the road. And I believe that the critical and major change that we made in Iraq was to find a way to reach out to the Sunni minority who were in the organized opposition, and through a combination of programs and efforts, realign them with the future that we saw. And while we didn't reconcile them completely with the Shia, who run the country on the basis of their electoral majority, we did at least achieve a period under which, rather than continued civil war and serious and indeed massive disruption and a greater danger to our military forces, we were able, after a period of time, to pull ourselves out. I think that if you look at this particular issue, and also look at Afghanistan in the same way, there are a number of questions to ask. Do great powers that intervene militarily also have an obligation and a need, foresight, to understand what the material results of combat operations require in terms of dealing with the future of the area where they have engaged? We were perhaps misled, maybe a bad application of foresight, by successes in places like Grenada or Panama. We were perhaps misled by the simple notion that massive military capacity would assure the appropriate political result. And we were, I think, very much misled, and we're still deeply engaged in a struggle to apply all of the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan to the problem of insurgency and asymmetrical warfare. And I think that finally, we ought to have a much clearer vision, foresight, of what our national interests are. Harry Truman said our national interests were survival of our country and its prosperity. And those two words, in Harry's view, were the central touchstones of what should drive our policies with respect to vital interests. Many might consider them too primary, too narrow. But it is, in my view, important to start with the central fundamentals when you begin to think about things like wars of choice. Most of the issues we deal with in the world today are high priority secondary issues on the scale of survival and prosperity. But we don't spend much time looking at them. The second set of issues that I'd like to raise with you is narrower and closer to home, and perhaps in some ways more unfinished than what we can say about Iraq. But that's its neighbor, Syria. It seems to me that with foresight, we would have had some better idea of what was coming. We would have had a better analysis of the flip judgment which drove our early efforts that the opposition would soon overwhelm President Assad and that military victory was close in and ready to move. And that particular misassessment, I think, encouraged too much Turkish, Qatari, and Saudi enthusiasm. In any event, we then reverted to the notion that a political settlement would be useful. But we did so on the basis of contracting out. We ourselves, in fact, adopted a series of positions that in two ways worked against that particular effort. One was insisting on supporting the opposition's preconditions for talks, which were in effect the establishment of the end game of talks before you could talk. And we all know in diplomacy that it might make good propaganda to move that, and maybe politically, practically, it was a useful way to consider keeping a vociferous opposition closer to a single effort than almost anything else we could think about. But my view is the time has come to change that. The second issue that I think, in a processed sense, has bedeviled the question of the future of Syria is a question that has to do, in effect, with finer networking, with closer possibilities. And I have to say that Senator, now Secretary Kerry, has been something of a breath of fresh air. That is, can we move the Russian piece in a way that counterparts our own efforts toward a political settlement? And I think it was useful in his trip to Moscow, and indeed Prime Minister Cameron's trip here yesterday, to begin to see not what one would call a tectonic shift, but a useful shift toward what I would call a process of international networking. That the US and Russia are necessary to move a political process, but not, in my view, yet sufficient. Other players have to be brought in, but in some ways they're the key. Another process question is what I call the malevolent influence of sloppy diplomacy, and that's linkage, that we have adopted as a result of the differences in the early stages, the paradigm that the negotiations have to be in the context of nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. And this is simply splendid as a way to get started. But I look around the room at those of you with negotiating experience, and you know when 70,000 people are killed and over 6,000 a month, and radicalization continues, and indeed the neighborhood has become deeply disturbed and destabilized, you need to think about how to move ahead with the most important factors, even if you can't solve everything. And so it seems to me that two other issues will come out of what I would call a combination of networking and indeed the ability after the fact in similar arrangements to see where the mistakes were made. And these two sets of arrangements fundamentally, in my view, swing on the question of can we and the Russians, if we can agree, drive a humanitarian ceasefire in Syria. It seems to me that that is the necessary next step, not a sufficient one. But I would compliment that if you could get it. And look, I've been around diplomacy a long time, and I know how hard it is to get it. But I also know that, in fact, if the bulk of the world community is behind it, and we begin to think of using military steps not to aggravate or to try to win the military conflict per se, but to be part of what is the diplomatic toolbox, as Dick Holbrooke did in Bosnia, then I think we have the beginnings of an activity here. And so my feeling is that if you can get a ceasefire, monitored, but certainly not, in my view, imposed by the UN, that's going way up, then you have a basis for the next step, and I think it's a quick step, and that is to use the UN well-founded capacities to, in fact, carry out elections, to bring about either a constituent assembly or an interim parliament, from which you then could move to a government choice with the legitimacy of the Syrian people behind it. And I know how difficult that is. But I see no possible route to a negotiated government anything near in the future. Could President Assad run for a constituent assembly? I would have no objection. He'd be one member. And part of the effort here is, in fact, to put in place something that will begin to recognize the will of the Syrians. And interestingly enough, when I talked to a Chinese diplomat 3 months ago, he said, this is our central position when I pushed him. You need to go to the Syrian people and get an answer. I think even these days, our friends in Iran are having second thoughts about Syria and where they are. And I think the Russians could be enormously useful in pushing them there. I don't want to use just this set of ideas to illustrate the 3 points, but I think they're very important and very germane. And a final point on Syria is that we have to find a way, particularly in the context of a ceasefire, to protect minorities. And this is a big task, and it's hard. But we've been through this in other places, and we've learned lessons. But I think the centerpiece of the Syrian question is the challenge of creating both strong networking in the United States, but even more importantly, the kind of international networking that helps when you have a tough problem and you're at least beginning to see that the players themselves understand their interests are not going to be prospered by continuing as they are. The third piece that I'd like to apply this lesson to is one that I have unfortunately been mired in, and one that I unfortunately was delayed coming here because I had to talk once again about it. There is an old aphorism in Washington that everything has been said, but not everybody has said it yet. The aphorism on Benghazi is that I've said everything, but not everybody has heard it yet. And so we're still working on that. But I think that foresight on Benghazi would have been tremendously important. Indeed, the report that I participated in found there was a serious lack of foresight in two directions: security preparations and the related assessment and use of intelligence. And everybody knows that Monday morning quarterbacking is absolutely perfect, and I feel the burden of that. However, in a situation in which there were over 40 incidents in eastern Libya involving foreigners, including physical attacks and other developments in the 6-month period before the attack on our mission, there was something out there that should have been paid attention to. I think more than it was, and I think that that's unfortunate. I think that on the networking side, there was more evidence, particularly in Benghazi, of people willing to work together jointly to face the problem. Certainly, both the State Department facility and the annex, while they could not create absolute plans because each had responsibilities for their own facility, had an agreement and frequently talked and indeed met with each other and examined each other's facility, that if it was possible, they would come to each other's aid, and that's what happened on the night of the event. It was unfortunate that because of roadblocks and difficulties, and indeed armed presence inside the State Department facility, it was not possible to bring those people together before 2 people died of asphyxiation. It was also interesting that the second facility was probably better prepared for defense, but much worse equipped to deal with bombings on their wall. And it was fascinating that in effect, the final attack on that facility lasted only 90 seconds, involved 5 mortar rounds, and unfortunately killed 2 people instantly and wounded severely a number of others, all through what I think was quite superior attackers' capacity to deal with the problem. And we probably underestimated that in some ways, even though we knew a lot about Libya. The lessons learned are enormous, but I have to tell you, one of them is not to make this a central subject of American political backbiting, which is now, I think, in its worst stage that I've seen for a long period of time. And I think the notion that we should turn our attention to talking points and not what we should be doing further to protect our people from any agency overseas and providing the funding for that is, in my view, a serious neglect and certainly an important point to put out there. There are many other issues that I think we could improve our performance and be smarter about how we deal with them if, in fact, a lot of these principles of anticipatory government are put into effect. My own sense is that we could give you other examples that go around the world where things have worked well because we applied some of this. The really difficult problem is to get a White House, a national security staff, and departments whose total day is driven by what cascades in over the transom and through the door, to begin to think down the road and apply resources and people to it that would, in effect, over a period of time, help them deal with that cascade and their performance. And it is, in my view, a serious problem that we are not able to take into account the notion that circumstances conspire against what I think is clear-headed thinking and intelligent proposals. And I hope all of you will look at this report. I hope that you will give it your best efforts. I hope that you would give feedback, the third obvious pillar of the report, to us and to others where you think it needs it, but my own view is that it represents as good a set of ideas as anyone has been able to put together for what I hope will be the National Security Reform Act of 2014. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickens. Well, I'm going to suggest now that we open up immediate to questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes. Please, if when you're asking your questions, state your name and affiliation, and then I'll ask both of our panelists to keep their answers relatively brief so that we can have time for a few questions before we wrap promptly at 11:15. Yes, sir.
Thanks. I'm Chip House from the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Before, Mr. Fuerth, I said I was going to ask you how you make this happen. I'm going to modify that and go back to a question that the ambassador raised. Short of tectonic plates, in other words, short of going from here to there by Friday, what are the doable short-term steps that could be done to take this paper, which I have to ask the same question I asked myself for my own ideas about how do you make this happen? What are the short-term things you think we can do?
Am I wired into the microphone system? Yes. That's a stalling tactic. You'll recognize. If I had a pipe, I'd be fiddling with it. When I began this work, I'd come out of 8 years of experience in the White House. And my model for how to bring about this change was entirely based essentially on the idea that one of these days a president would sign an executive order leading to a study, leading to recommendations, leading to changes in the way the system operates, just short of the point where you'd have a constitutional issue whether you had to go to the Congress to legislate it. It isn't working that way. Since the report was published, I've become aware of another process, unanticipated, which does seem to be working, but it's not one that you can deal with in a very neat package. What I discovered is that these ideas, whether they come from me or somebody else, these ideas are around and current and scattered around agencies and being dealt with almost on an opportunistic basis by people inside of the different agencies as applied to their work. That's a very interesting take. It reminds me that I began by talking about net-centric operations which depend upon initiative at lower levels. And so I've begun to rethink just how far that process could take us towards creating a more fluid system, pending the point at which the president, and only the president, can bring about the national focus that's required to make this thing a conversion of how we really do business as a country. So I would say short answer is turn attention to initiative at agency and sub-agency level and encourage communications between agencies that conceive of themselves as being involved in common activities, whether or not those things are written into their legal mandates.
Do you have anything to add to that, Ambassador?
No, I think that one of Leon's primary purposes in doing the report was to show how it could be done without legislation. And at the end, I recommended legislation, but it was only a kind of way of saying that at some point, I would hope that the Congress would also pick up on this. But I think you're right, Leon, it's an eminently practical question. The really interesting issue is whether you can get intra-agency networking first, and then interagency networking. And to me, the place that would make that most likely to happen is the National Security Staff and their activities.
Brett.
Thank you very much. Look forward to reading the full report. But it seems to me, Leon, that there's a layer missing, which Tom outlined in his appearances on such programs as Morning Joe illustrate the vital significance of, which is the public dialogue, the congressional political dialogue that goes on because that has become so integral to the way in which we make decisions and treat issues that the kinds of separate rationality that you're describing in your three are simply unrealistic in real life. That the way we do the metaphors, the way we do the Hollywood sound bites, the way we do the political vote-getting initiatives is now so integral to the way in which the actual policy processes go on that we either figure out a better way to integrate those two things, or we're just going to get worse and worse at our performance in the layers that you're talking about. It can't be a sidelight. I mean, Tom, you're great at translating from the policy realm into the public explanation realm, but very few of our officials think of that as their full-time responsibility, because if we don't get that right, the political support not only erodes but completely interferes with our ability to execute on policies. So, I mean, Syria, Benghazi, Iraq, it's all about getting the explanation, the simple explanation that the political figures in the public will understand and support. And if that goes wrong, then it messes up the next decision and the one after that. So thinking through how we can, what that process is all about and how we can improve our ability to manage that process, to me, is fundamental to the kinds of reforms that you want to make in the decision-making process.
Comment? I agree. For 6 or 7 years, in between being a Foreign Service officer and becoming a member of Gore's staff when he was in the House, I was on various congressional staffs. I was hired to help the late Congressman Les Aspin run his subcommittee on covert action in the House Select Committee on Intelligence, and was there for 6 years. And a lot of my work for Congressman and then Senator Gore had to do with his committee assignments on the Armed Services Committee and on the House Science and Technology Committee. So, believe me, I am well aware of these things, but the system is sick. It did not have this kind of fever in the days when I was an active staffer. Other things were possible. So my attitude here is that these kinds of changes in the functioning of the executive branch should also be used by a president to encourage a different kind of dialogue with the Congress. You won't find this in the report, I don't think, but I thought that a president could really attempt to start a second budgetary dialogue with the Congress. The present budgetary dialogue is bean counters logic. It has to do with the money for agencies and programs and a gotcha kind of oversight. It doesn't have to do with the end state of where the United States as a country and as a society should wind up as the result of the composite effect of all these expenditures. It is possible to begin with that and to break that down derivatively into the meaning of the budget request and to have a dialogue, or at least offer a dialogue with the Congress over what that means. And more primary than that, it is possible for a president to connect the budget to the future of this country for the people in a way that the system presently doesn't do. And changing the people's perception of where our resources are supposed to take us is probably the prologue to getting the system to work better.
Just a few words. Thank you, Fred, for your very kind comments. They're often part of a sucker bowl, but you and I are friends, and I know you don't throw me sucker bowls, at least not every day, and I'm very grateful. I think that everything Leon has said I agree with. I think that in a presidency, there are only a certain number of things that can be changed, and I understand that presidents have to find ways to prioritize and ration. I also think that there are serious problems of overpromise and underdeliver that need to be looked at in where we're going. I finally think that presidential leadership in risky circumstances where there is still a pretty good chance of moving things is as good a motivator, a bully pulpit for the public. And for your point that to make these kinds of changes, you probably need, in some ways, to get a public support and a public interest, a public realization. Why can't we do better? You know, what's wrong? And there I think the president is quite critical. The real question is this sufficiently important to be attended to by the president? And as long as the daily messes overwhelm the process of looking ahead, which this effort is trying to cure, it is a victim, if you put it this way, of the analysis which motivates it to make the change. And in some ways, that's really quite sad and difficult. And I don't know an easy way to turn this around, but I think it really has to kind of be a White House project in one way or another. Leon is right. Much can bubble up and much can be organized, but at some level, people then have to start putting agencies together and moving people across the old stovepipes and barriers. And I think that's where it's harder to move it.
Yes, sir, in the orange tie.
Thank you very much. My name is David Alfer with Safer World, and just to throw an extra level of complexity into this, given how many of the, and I hear this in both of your discussions, the threats and opportunities that we find ourselves confronted with and offered in the field are subnational, civil society based, they are tribal, they are religious, they are ethnic.
And that's
What-
just in the United States.
And that's just, exactly. What I hear the discussion focused on is an interagency effort, and as laudable as that is, I wonder how much connectivity those agencies have with the drivers that we find in the field. The places those are coming from, the languages that they speak, metaphorically speaking, and whether there is room or an effort for more of a civil society engagement, as some parts of the State Department, for example, are pursuing in order to bring another perspective into this that the government may lack if we are going to reach the level of complexity and foresight that you're looking for.
I have an internal conflict over this. After too many years in government, I have to fight off the tendency to think that talking with the people is a kind of metaphor as opposed to an operational requirement. Then comes what I derive of the people when I look, let's say, at internet traffic, where people are commenting on issues, except they mainly seem to be yelling at each other and everybody else over these things, not very encouraging way to. But then there is the question of is there some kind of gyroscopic stability in public opinion? And I kept on turning to things like the Pew Foundation public opinion polls, which seem to say that although the margins get the attention because they are the noisiest, and God forbid anybody should say that I'm talking about a silent majority, nevertheless, there seems to be a more stable and very sensible core of opinion which threads its way through these extreme alternatives and usually comes to rest over reasoned trade-offs that are quite good. In other words, if the premise of our democracy is that the people have the smarts to govern themselves, I think the premise is right, except that we have evolved in ways which are increasingly making that impossible to happen. Which leads me to my final comment regarding your question and yours. Politics is a slave to money. Until and unless we find a way to break the link between what members of Congress have to do to finance their careers in politics, we're going to get this. And in order to liberate policymakers to think better, I think you have to do something about the way in which politics are being run and financed. And frankly, I think that goes to the question of how our elections are run and in particular to the cost of access to the media. This is a structural requirement for the survival of democracy in the United States. We have to find a way to fix it.
Again, I agree with all of Leon's points. I've thought a lot about it. I do think that we have a fundamental imperative in electoral reform. Everything from gerrymandering to financing. I mean, I personally would favor the Australian system where you have to at least to go to the polls. You don't have to vote if you don't want to, but you have to show up. But I think there are a lot of other things that are out there. And it is fascinating that you see this undercurrent in the American public in the polls. A lot may depend upon who is the smartest question confector. Because the questions, I think, do influence a lot of polling results. But you have this year in and year out, the Chicago World Council poll on foreign assistance, and the constant statement 25% is too high of our budget for foreign assistance, and 10% is exactly right, and of course it's below 1%. And so, in effect, there's an information gap somewhere out there as well that the administrations don't seem to find a way to pick up on. And to some extent, I think you need to get smarter in your discussions with the American public and smarter in your ways of dealing with it. And unfortunately, I think in the blogosphere, it's the angry young wackos who have the greatest amount of voices because people are interested in seeing what idiotic comments are in terms of where things are going. It's too bad. But I think that we do need fundamental reform in our electoral system to get back to things that used to work pretty well and that we can move ahead on.
Time for one last question. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Rachel Burton from the National Bureau.
For public office anytime soon?
No, sir. I've been running for public office for years.
I'm Rachel from the National Bureau of Asian Research and 5 days away from graduating at GW.
Ah,
So this is how I
we
spent
hope
my
you
senior
make
week. But
we're
my
going to
question,
grade this question.
well, my background is in Asia, and I was actually wondering how anticipatory governance can relate to the rebalance to Asia and how it addresses emerging security threats via like resources and cybersecurity.
It's not a dodge. I need for you to repeat the last phrase in your question because I couldn't hear it clearly.
My question was how anticipatory governance can sort of address emerging security threats via resources and cybersecurity.
Okay, well, only one thing comes immediately to mind, and it may be counterintuitive, and there's a lot else to say, but our time is short.
Yeah.
I think it is essential to know the past if you're going to think with any value about the future. And I believe that in many cases, our approach to teaching young people about political science in the future and whatnot is driven more by numbers than by wisdom. Okay? If you want to talk about dealing with the changes that are occurring because of what is coming at the world from Asia, it's necessary to have people who understand something about Asia that gets down to the level of what is it really like to be born and raised there as opposed to stick model versions of international relationships. That means that the kind of values that you find in the diplomatic system at its best, where people are invested with parts of their lives in understanding other societies, that's a crucial resource as opposed to something that needs to be banished to the anteroom.
I would just add one piece. You raised cyber. I've been concerned about several tendencies. One, the tendency to believe that offensive cyber is more important these days. The tendency to believe that, and may be true, that cyber can kind of bring down your national systems in an unforeseen and certainly inopportune way. And that seemingly, at least there's exasperation about providing adequate defense. I finally think that if in fact all of that is true, and I raise a question about it, then we ought to begin to think about what was helpful to us in a world in which nuclear weapons played a similar role. and it's a little hard to see the stretch. And I ask you, because I'm only raising the analysis here, but if that's the case, and all players have reason to feel the offensive capability of the other, but have a capacity to retaliate, then the wreckage we can create is only limited by the imagination. And the protection in that regard is not so much defense as the absolute necessity of cooperation to avoid offensive disaster. And so I am very much interested to see whether, in fact, this problem is susceptible to a kind of arms control treatment. And should we be thinking about that? I don't know the answer to that. It may be loony, it may not, but it seems to me that it is sufficient challenge to begin at least to look at it. Well, here's some foresight, some certainly networking has to engage in this particular kind of things, and we have some reasonable lessons from the past of what worked and was helpful. And it didn't work because people were altruistic, it worked because people were scared that if they didn't behave, they would make things a lot worse for themselves and the rest of the world. And it was important to look at it that way. So I think there are directions here that we need to be thinking more about, and I think that it fits very well with anticipatory government, which asks these questions about future stuff as well as about current stuff. Climate change, things that we've been reluctant to address. I think we probably need to engage a little more, and I think that if there were resources and structures that grew out of the tentative efforts that people are now making that Leon identified, one could see the evolution of a set of governmental arrangements, which I think in the first place meets the test of common sense. This isn't a kind of rocket science proposition.
Let me just quickly add something that your comment suggested. 30 years ago, the big issue was nuclear first strike capability and strategic instability. And the existing paradigm was whatever the other side did, we had to do. And the other side looked at us and said, whatever they did, we have to do. And the result was an escalating competition in destructive power. It wasn't until the United States began to pursue a new concept of strategic stability, which said both sides have to feel secure against a first strike, or neither side is secure, that we began to find forms of progress that were incorporated in an arms control agreement. And I think where it comes to cyber, the paradigm is going to be the same. Unless there is security for both sides, there cannot be security for either.
With that, I think we will wrap this discussion. Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. Thank you, Leon Fuerth. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future USIP events. Thank you both.